the United States, Jimmy Carter. And he comes from a background in Georgia. So he was very much an outsider to the Washington establishment. He did get the nomination, and he ran against President Ford. And in that case, it was a close call, but Carter did win. So Carter comes to the White House with a group of people that he knew well in Atlanta. Carter had been governor of Georgia, and he had a very excellent staff there that he insisted on bringing with him to run the White House. The same way that Jack Kennedy, who came as an outsider, a Roman Catholic from Boston, he brought with him what we call the Irish Mafia, part of the Harvard faculty and part of the Irish establishment. And so now we have another outsider, a Southern Baptist, bringing his group with him, people he trusted and had known when he was governor. The key man in that will be Hamilton Jordan, who's from North Carolina and who loved politics and who went south instead of north to get involved in the politics, because politics on a large scale were in Washington, D.C. But he went down to Atlanta and ran Carter's governor's campaign and became a trusted member of the inner circle. Georgia is a rather strange and different state. Just like the Kennedys had Hyannisport as a vacation place, Georgians had the Sea Islands off the coast of Georgia as vacation place, particularly St. Simon's Island, which is a beautiful place and was used by Civil War and previous to Civil War Georgia elites as summer homes, because the heat in a Georgia summer is unbearable. So if you can get to an island where there are island breezes, you have a very pleasant lifestyle. Also, the Sea Islands are very famous in Black history because a group of Yoruba-speaking African slaves were brought there, and they worked the cotton, and they worked a very special long staple cotton that wears as if it were silk. It's very hard to raise, very manually difficult, and we call those African Americans who were on those islands Gullah. And the Gullah people kept their language and kept their traditions, which in many other areas of the South were wiped out. And this Georgia that you might get to know is the Georgia also of a very famous novel, Gone with the Wind, written by a woman from Atlanta, and a very controversial film today because there is a question as to whether the film is in fact racist or not. Now, there are some very racist films. If you want one, just go and look at the first Grieg silent film, and you will see racism writ large. But in this case, it's debatable. And I think when I show the film here, which I'm going to do in a couple of weeks, not on this Zoom process, but on a film that we do in the evenings here, then we will follow it with a debate to get us a little bit more knowledgeable about what a real racist film would look like. And it's always a matter of opinion anyway. So I want you to know also there is in Georgia today still a political elite, much of it an African-American elite. And the leader of that is a woman I greatly admire, Stacey Abrams. And she would be a wonderful candidate for Mr. Joe Biden if he's looking for a woman, which I certainly hope he is. This is a very capable woman. She's been in politics for some time. She is very well educated, has gotten degrees from the University of Texas and from Yale University, where she got her law degree. So you should look for her name in the future, Stacey Abrams from Georgia. But let's move on now to Jimmy. Jimmy had great ambitions. He was born in Plains, Georgia. He was married. He had a daughter. Before the daughter came along, Jimmy had a great ambition to be a naval officer. And he went north to Annapolis and graduated from the Naval Academy. And at that point in time, the most fashionable new ship were the submarines, the nuclear submarines of Rickover's nuclear navy. Rickover was the first Jewish American to rise to the rank of a 4-star admiral. And so it was that Jimmy Carter became a submariner and had great ambitions to stay for his lifetime within the Navy. The unfortunate thing was his father died, and this meant that there was a farm to protect. And so Jimmy left the Navy and returned to Georgia, to Plains, where he put a peanut plantation to work and made it work. It made money. He was successful, but he then caught the political bug. And so he became, in his own time, governor of the state of Georgia. When the time came for him to go north to try out for the White House, he ran against, of course, the Republican candidate, Mr. Ford. Ford, who had been vice president to Richard Nixon and had ascended to the presidency when Nixon resigned. Ford had then issued a pardon to Nixon, which was controversial, but not enough to block his attempt to run in his own right. As it was, Carter won by a small margin and became president of the United States. Then he moved north to Washington, where he brought his own Georgia mafia, if you prefer, those insiders. You have to understand that in our country, which is actually really a continent, not so much a country, we don't have shadow governments. If you go to the British system, and if you ever watch a debate in the House of Commons, you will see sitting there both sides, that is a Labour government in waiting if the Conservatives are in power, or conservative Tories waiting if Labour is in power. And so you can spot the leadership of the next government, what we call a shadow government. We don't have that. What we have, though, is another system. If you go to Washington, you could find 2 major institutes where the shadow governments of the United States are often waiting for the change of government so that they can come in. One is the Brookings Institution, which is usually where you'd find the shadow government of Democrats waiting to get back in the White House if the Republicans lose. And if the Democrats are in and lose, you have a Republican shadow government over the American Enterprise Institute. So at least we have places where insiders are there. They're people who, how to put this? We have a word in Virginia where I grew up. The river that we talk about is the Potomac, which of course is the river that runs by the Washington establishment who lived down in Georgetown or over in Alexandria. Now, in that particular case, you can catch a very special fever called Potomac fever. And simply, it's a love of political power. It means you want more than anything to be in office running something like the Labor Department, the Defense Department, the State Department, or if you have greater ambitions, you'd like to be vice president or president. So it is that we have our own version of a shadow government. But then when someone like Kennedy or Carter come from the outside, and particularly Carter, who had had no Washington real experience, at least Kennedy had had years as a senator, as a young senator living in Georgetown with his wife, Jackie. But now you're going to have the Carters come as outsiders. And they're going to have a difficult transition time because the Congress is in the control of the Democrats, but very strange Democrats. The Speaker of the House is Tip O'Neill, an Irishman from the old Irish mafia of the Kennedy years. And in the Senate, there still is a Kennedy alive, Ted Kennedy. In fact, Ted Kennedy had tried to get the nomination for the presidency, which of course Carter won instead. It's a very sad case because there was no way Ted would ever win, given the Republicans already had a slogan for him, which went as follows, quote, "No one drowned at Watergate," end quote, which simply means that the horrible event of Chappaquiddick, where a young girl drowned in Ted Kennedy's car, would haunt him for the rest of his political life. So the Carters arrive. Carter looks for some outside help. Obviously, he can't completely fill government with Georgians. And he wanted a national security advisor who came from the academy, another faculty member who specialized in foreign policy. And since Kissinger is gone now, he's married and he's gone to New York and found a company called Kissinger Associates. Now we have a new man in town. And so Jimmy turns to Columbia University, where there is a very powerful professor by the name of Zbigniew Brzezinski. That's Zbig for short, for Zbigniew Brzezinski. Zbig is a very devout Polish Catholic American. And this means almost immediately a very anti-Russian personality. And he came into the government, and Cyrus Vance came into the government as the Secretary of State. And so Carter, began to put together the things he wanted to do. He'd been left with a terrible, terrible heritage by Nixon and Kissinger. Right at the end of their time in office, they had sent a green light for a coup d'etat against the elected president of Chile, Salvador Allende. And it so happened that Salvador Allende was a man of the left, at least a socialist and perhaps flirting with Marxism. But that is not our business. But Nixon and Kissinger made it our business, and they sent a green light that we would support a coup d'etat. And so Allende's government was overthrown. In the coup, Allende was murdered. And now we have this dreadful person, Pinochet, a general, as the head of the Chilean government. And soon those lights will go green again for Argentina, Brazil. So the ABC countries of South America will all turn into military dictatorships with our blessing, which is a major, major mistake. It shouldn't surprise you that people from South America and Central America remember all these terrible things that we did. They remember United Fruit, which made banana republics out of all the Central American countries. They remember Anaconda Copper, which is an American company, tried to make Chile into an American satellite. So all these bitter, bitter memories remain. And Carter was aware of this. He was very sensitive to the nature that we had made a mess in the Americas, and we ought to undo some of that. So he turned his attention to a famous canal, the Panama Canal. And he decided that his administration would push through the Congress a Panama Canal Treaty, in which over a number of years, 8 to 10, we would return the canal zone, which was ours. It was where a 4-star American Army general ran the place, the canal zone. It's where we and our laws were maintained and Panamanians were not allowed. It was a true example of imperialism at work. And so it was that Carter pushed, pulled, and finally got his treaty approved. In the Senate, there was a man who violently opposed this treaty, His name was Barry Goldwater. And he made a very famous speech in which he said, quote, he, Carter, he is giving away our canal, end quote. It wasn't our canal, it was a Panamanian canal. They also predicted that it would go to rack and ruin, that they didn't know how to run a canal, and it would fill up and be turned into junk. In fact, that didn't happen. I was there a year ago. I took a group of California alumni from Berkeley, and the canal is wonderful. It's now been rebuilt with a new passage. It has deeper, longer, wider locks so that larger and larger ships can take the passage from one side to the other. And it's also a wonderful source of revenue to the Panamanian government. So without our help, they have made a better canal. They had the Italians design the locks, Italians in Genoa. They had other groups of Europeans help them. They got no help from us. And yet it's a bigger and better canal. And it also took this sore point in which South American and Central Americans elite hated us for this sense of the imperial eagle from the north. They called El Norte. So it was a plus, I think, very much a plus in Carter's peacemaking, his outreach. We had had for years a policy of the good neighbor. But in fact, if this was a good neighbor, God only knows what a bad neighbor would have done to them. So they began to change their opinion of us and see us in a better light. It'll take centuries, of course, to wipe out the past, but at least Carter began the start of something good. Carter, of course, and his group, as many other intelligent Americans, knew there was a great literature to our South. You could read Carlos Fuentes, the great novelist of Mexico, The Strange Death of Artemio Cruz. Or you could read the greatest novel, perhaps, of the modern day, the novel by Garcia Marquez about solitude. And so it was, from the poets, Octavio Paz in Mexico, to Pablo Neruda, or you could read the novels from Marin County, right here in California, where Isabel Allende lives to this very day, publishing and writing wonderful novels that take you all over the Spanish-speaking and Brazilian-speaking, Portuguese, Brazilian-speaking south of our country. A rich heritage that we should enjoy, and we should join with them in real efforts towards building a better community in the Americas, which is what we were trying to do as early as World War II. Franklin Roosevelt looked around and saw that there was trouble brewing, and that was in Argentina, where a true fascist had come to power, Juan Perón. And Juan Perón was married to a really dreadful woman, a Argentinian whore, Eva Perón. And together they were turning Argentina into a fascist state. So it was that Roosevelt told his Secretary of State, get the word to them that if they do anything at all to help Hitler's regime here in the Americas, it will be the end of their regime. And so it was that the Peronists kept a low profile while our Secretary of State watched over them to see that they did not move in the direction of European fascists. They could just be American fascists. Terrible, terrible thing. And then we all had to sit through, if you go to Broadway, like I do a lot, to listen to a musical that actually celebrated Eva Perón. The musical opened in London. It was called Evita, with Patti LuPone, and the famous opening song, Don't Cry for Me, Argentina. And there you had her almost as a sainted figure, which is far from what she was and far from what that Argentina that she and her so-called lover, later husband, Juan Perón, ran to our south. Carter knew a little bit about this. He had actually studied things. You don't go to the Naval Academy to just study submarines, you study history. And so he had a little dose of that, and he had worked to make sure that we turned a corner in our policies toward the South. And I consider his deal with the Canal Treaty, which was long and drawn out. We didn't turn it over to them for 8 years while we watched and waited step by step for them to take over what was theirs from us, who didn't, in fact, own it. When he succeeded there, he turned the next year to a subject that had bothered Americans for years and which seemed to go nowhere, and this was peace in the Middle East. And so Carter decided that you couldn't do it through sending Henry Kissinger here and there. What you had to do was bring them here. And the him that they wanted were two of them, former terrorists themselves in their youth. One was from Israel, Menachem Begin, and the other was from Egypt, Anwar Sadat. And so he cajoled them to coming together at a mountain resort in Maryland that is given to the president. It's called Camp David, very pleasant place, high up, cool. And there, he sort of held them prisoner. He was determined to knock their heads together till they came up with a solution for peace in the Middle East. And so it was on a bright and wonderful day when Anwar Sadat spoke up, looking straight at Menachem Begin and said, "Land for peace, peace for land." And what he was talking about was in the last of several Israeli-Egypt Arab wars, the Israelis had taken the Sinai Desert away from us being the Egyptians. And so Sadat wanted it back. It had always been Egyptian and he wanted it back. So he would give peace to Israel in exchange for the land. This is a very hard decision because when Israel took the Sinai, many Israelis went there as settlers, and now they didn't want to leave. And it took ordering the Israeli Defense Forces, that's the Israeli military, to go in and literally move them by force out of the Sinai so that the Sinai could come back to Egypt and Egypt could establish an Egyptian embassy in Tel Aviv, and Israel could establish an Israeli embassy in Cairo. And this was a step so much for good that Carter deserves great praise. Unfortunately, things in the Middle East unravel quickly. And on a military parade day in Cairo, watching his soldiers pass by, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood who was in the military turned his rifle and fired and killed Sadat outright. So he paid for the peace with his life. And not to be outdone in horror, a year or so later, a new prime minister is in Tel Aviv. His name is Yitzhak Rabin. And Rabin is showing an attempt to build on peace. And so he has looked carefully at the Oslo Accords, where there had been an attempt to develop a plan for peace with the Palestinians. And he was going to follow that peace plan. His reward, he was shot dead in Israel, not by a Palestinian, not by an Arab from another country, but from an Israeli man with an Israeli gun and an Israeli bullet, killed, murdered, assassinated, whatever word you want to use, Rabin. So it came that there's a famous phrase, "Blessed are the peacekeepers," but it should have a little longer ring to it. It should be, Blessed are the peacekeepers, they will soon be martyrs. At least what Carter had tried to do to build peace, he was trying to put a bridge in that would connect Arab and Israeli in the way that the early Israeli leadership had hoped it would work. People like Ben Gurion. But it had not worked. But at least Carter gave it a good Georgia try. Things began to turn badly for Carter. The Soviets did not remain completely quiet all during this time. And a very clever group in the Kremlin, working, of course, under their leadership, Mr. Brezhnev, the party chairman, had decided to expand the Soviet sphere of influence. Now, when we had a rather mediocre Secretary of State under Eisenhower, John Foster Dulles, Dulles had always called for a breakout, that the Soviet satellites should in fact rebel and try to leave and succeed in leaving the Soviet sphere. And so the poor Hungarians believed us. And in 1956, there was a Hungarian Budapest revolt, and it was ruthlessly put down by the Warsaw Pact, ordered to do so, of course, because it was a Soviet military pact like our NATO. And the Hungarian Revolution was squashed. What could get out, got out. Some of them actually swam the Danube, which is not an easy swim. And it was obvious then to the world that we would not come to the rescue because we knew that they knew that we knew it would mean war with the Soviet Union. So this had gone down not well in conservative circles in America because we did believe in rollback, that we could roll back the Soviet Union. In fact, we couldn't roll back the Soviet Union without a nuclear war. So now we have Brezhnev, who's also aware of the dangers. He knows, of course, that McNamara had left his mark on American defense policy when he was with Kennedy and Johnson, with the mutual assured destruction strategy, again, that we knew that they knew that we knew that we would fire our nuclear weapons if they moved against our central interest. So now Brezhnev was having his people carefully work out a plan. There was in the very backward third world state of Afghanistan the possibility of a Marxist government coming to power. So there was an attempt to run a coup d'etat in Kabul, in which Afghanistan would suddenly be pro-Soviet instead of neutral. The problem was that there were Afghans who didn't like that idea, and they crushed this early Soviet government. This angered Brezhnev. So now, very foolishly, he decided to send in the Red Army to crush the Afghan rebels. And he did. This infuriated Carter and his advisors. It put an end, as far as Carter was concerned, with détente with the Soviet Union. It meant also that Carter would refuse the Olympic team, the Americans, to go to the Olympics that year, which were being held in the Soviet Union. And it meant that he would listen to his very dangerous national security advisor, Zbigniew. Zbig got to be known very well on the American campus that he was from, Columbia, and the Berkeley campus. At Berkeley, we also had a very strident anti-Russian who was the head of our Middle East program and also a full professor in the political science department, George Linchowsky. And George often entertained Zbig in his home in Berkeley and would invite many of us over for the dinner party, which usually was rather explosive. I remember asking Zbig, how did he find the Carter White House? And he said, oh, it was quite wonderful. And he had the best ally in Rosalind Carter. And I said, in what way is she your best ally? And he said that Rosalind, in the first year they were there, had approached him and said, Mr. Jabrinsky, I know you prepare the Black Book every night for my husband to read so that he'll have the latest intelligence worldwide. And I want you to prepare the same book for me because we discuss this at night when we are upstairs in the White House. And Zbig did as she requested. And he saw that she was a very formidable force in Jimmy's life, that he turned to her for advice. And she was a very, very smart woman. And so it was that we saw that Zbig was looking for allies within the inner circle of the Carter team. And he'd found it in Mrs. Carter. And this came to play when the next step arrives. With the arrival of Soviet land forces, Soviet military, Soviet army in Afghanistan, they failed miserably, as we are going to later fail miserably, to listen to the British experience in Afghanistan. During the 19th century, India, which was then India and Pakistan, was the British Raj, the British Empire in South Asia. They found it very difficult to deal with the Afghans, but they never tried to invade. They went up to the Khyber Pass, which is the pass that leads you out of what is today Pakistan into Afghanistan. Afghanistan, and all those words that end in stan, is a Persian name. When you say Afghanistan or Kyrgyzstan or Uzbekistan, you're saying the place of the Uzbeks, the place of the Afghans. It's how the Persians named it. And there at Khyber Pass, you should not go further. British Army people knew that because they tried to go once over and they lost terribly. And to lose to the Afghans meant if you were taken alive, you were burnt alive over an open fire. So British soldiers always carried an extra bullet for themselves, lest they be captured by the Afghans. And yet now, the place was swimming with Russians who were dying badly because the Afghans did not greet them with open arms. And so it was that Zbig came forward and talked Jimmy Carter into giving to the Afghans who were defending themselves from the Soviets, giving them the newest weapon that we had developed. It was a shoulder-fired missile, meaning I could put it up on my shoulder, aim it, and fire and bring down a Soviet aircraft. And the Soviets were using for transportation because Afghanistan is the roughest terrain on earth. Mountains, mountain passes, goat trails, etc. They were using helicopters. And now suddenly these Stinger rockets were bringing down many, many Soviet helicopters, so badly so that finally Brezhnev is going to have to withdraw his forces as Britain had to withdraw their forces, and as we, my friends, will soon be forced to withdraw our forces, which are in the longest war we've ever fought, and which we are losing hour by hour, day by day, month by month, year by year. Afghanistan, a terrible blow for the Soviets, but there was another blow coming, and this time for us. We had meddled badly in South Asia and the Persian Gulf. Long ago, before Carter was ever involved, there had been an election in Iran, an election, my word, and they had elected Mossadegh as their prime minister. Mossadegh announced that he was going to, which is legal to do, nationalize the Anglo-Iranian oil company in Abadan on the Iranian coast of the Persian Gulf. We didn't like that. The British didn't like that. Others didn't like that. So a young man working for that agency of trouble, the Central Intelligence Agency, Kermit Roosevelt, arranged a coup d'etat in which Mossadegh was thrown out of office. And we brought in the young Pahlavi Shah, the man that became the Shah of Iran. And he started something actually good. He started a white revolution. He was going to, excuse me, he was going to change things economically. You could open a business, do whatever you wanted to do, invest. He was going to send you away to school. He sent many, many, many students, thousands, to UC Berkeley, to Stanford. The place looked like an Iranian stronghold. You could also marry anybody you wanted to. What you couldn't do is run a political party. The Shah had a secret police who were very effective in blocking any political attempt to run campaigns against the Shah. And so it was that things went along for a while, and then they didn't. And there was a man living in Paris, where I'd like to be, but I'm not. Living in Paris, he's an Ayatollah, the highest rank within Shiite Islam, the Ayatollah Khomeini. And on this day when things were looking bad, he took an Air France flight from Paris to Tehran, and he had arrived home. He'd been living in exile all this time, hating the Shah and the Shah's retinue. Now he was willing to take Iran backward, back from the 20th century to the 7th century, and set up a theocracy, government by religious leaders. Probably the worst thing that can happen to any nation, which should be remembered by a number of people. And as it was, there were demonstrations. Finally, the Shah fled. Many of the Shah's people live here in the Bay Area. His sister lives over in Palo Alto. I met her once at a dinner party at George Linchowski's. Now, this wasn't enough for those who had driven the Shah out. There was a saying about us: we were the great Satan. Again, a religious analogy. And there were demonstrations now in front of the American embassy. There were also demonstrations at the same time in front of the Soviet embassy, because the Soviets were also a great Satan. For the Ayatollahs, there are lots of Satans. Now, the Soviets took badly to this. We, of course, were unhappy. There is a stark difference. We now know through the ability of the National Security Agency up at Fort Meade, Maryland, that there was a burst transmission from Moscow to their embassy in Tehran. You slow that burst down, which you can do with very expensive Cray computers made by IBM. And then you can break the code if you're good. And then the message will simply say, go immediately to see the new leader of Iran and tell him the following, quote, if the demonstrations in front of the Soviet embassy in Tehran do not cease immediately, Iran, as we have historically known it, will cease to exist, end quote. The Russian ambassador showed up at the holy city of Qom, where the Ayatollah was in residence, presented the message, and within a matter of few hours, all the demonstrators in front of the Soviet embassy were gone. And in fact, guards were there now to protect the Soviet embassy, guards sent by the Ayatollah. We didn't send any such message. And so, of course, they took our people hostage. This was a great affront, as seen by Zbig Brzezinski. And Zbig convinced the Carter administration to send a rescue mission. This was strongly opposed by the State Department and our Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance. And when he saw that Zbig would have his way, Vance resigned. Our rescue mission was a total disaster. We flew in and landed, crash landed in a sandstorm. Our rescue teams were all captured, if not dead. And so now, and by the way, our people stayed there captive for 444 days. This was not a good sign for Carter's re-election to be president, for there was on the horizon a very strong contender on the Republican side. You people who live in California know him well. He had been your governor for 8 years. His name is Ronald Reagan, who will be the 40th president of the United States. And so now you have Jimmy Carter trying desperately to pull these many pieces that he can together. But the fates are not in his side. The disaster of the Iranian rescue, the disaster of the fall of our embassy. I've been to Iran in the last 10 years, and our embassy is still there, and it's marked as a historic site by the Iranians. They pointed out in triumph that they took it and took it away from us. And we now have even an ongoing quarrel with them. It appears that you're, and I think another very decent man, just like Carter, a very decent man. This one was Barack Obama, working with the many European powers that were concerned, that is the French, British, and Germans, that the Iranian search for a nuclear weapon was destabilizing for the entire region. And there should be and could be an arrangement with the Iranians to stop that. And so there was an agreement made, which has since been canceled by us, to stop research for an Iranian nuclear bomb. Now apparently the Iranians are again working. Their facilities are hard to see because they're underground. Iran is a high plateau, which keeps it nice and dry and cool. And in that plateau are many mountains. And inside some of those mountains are research facilities doing research on nuclear weapons. So we have an ongoing problem with Iran in the Gulf, with people who want to force a showdown with the Iranians. We've already done that by ruining the possible competition by invading Iraq and setting up a very false, phony, second, third-rate government there. The errors are endless, but you can't blame them on Carter. They came later. For Carter, he had two great moments in the sun. He has the Panama Canal Treaty, which is now very, very successful. And he has the desperate attempt to bring peace to that most unpeaceful world of the Middle East. But it was a solid, good, heartfelt attempt. Carter is going to lose the election, of course, to Reagan. He had another terror strike. I know that some of you out there listening are younger than I, so I even don't remember the Spanish flu of the early 20s out of World War I. I certainly remember what we're going through now, which is hell on earth, the pandemic. But before that, in your lifetime, there was another. It struck mainly gay and bisexual men, but it quickly was able to move into the blood supply. There was a nun at St. Mary's Hospital over in San Francisco who died of AIDS because she had had a blood transfusion and the AIDS virus, acquired immune deficiency, had moved into the blood that she got, and then she got it, and then she died. Those who do research, medical history, believe that AIDS broke loose from Central Africa, somewhere in the Congo, somewhere where the meat of an animal was eaten raw, and that took this disease into the human area. It moved then rapidly around the African scene and then somehow got into Europe. It is thought that AIDS first came to the United States on a Lufthansa flight where a German male, gay man was flying from Frankfurt to New York. And in New York, which has a gay community, very large, the disease spread and spread widely in the United States as an airborne disease. People with AIDS could fly to San Francisco, which was hit badly by the AIDS epidemic. So this is compounding the problem because people in America expect that our government will take a very serious role. Research started slowly at first, then quicker. A very great research center was ahead of us, the Pasteur Institute in Paris, because AIDS was already prevalent in the French community. And so it is that you now have this on the scene, and you have a very difficult problem. Male politicians do not like to talk about this subject. Maybe not talking will mean it'll go away. The man who will replace Carter, Ronald Reagan, had a feeling that it was unpresidential to even say AIDS out loud. People began to write about it. Larry Kramer, who just died this week, wrote Broadway plays about the problem as it struck the Broadway community. This is not Jimmy Carter's fault, but sometimes you can live in the best of times, and sometimes you can live in the worst of times. And Carter was finding that last year with a failed mission to rescue the American hostages, with the war going on in Afghanistan. Things unraveled. His Secretary of State resigning, the furnishing of weapons to the Afghan rebels to fire against the Soviets who had invaded Afghanistan, the canceling of the American teams going to the Soviet Union for the Olympics. All these are, if you know anything about sports in America, we are sports crazy. And the idea of going off and winning some gold medals at the Olympics is a high mark of excellence. And now we weren't going. We weren't going to show our strong displeasure of a Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. I want you to know that among the many presidents I've talked about and the many that I think about as an American historian, Jimmy Carter comes across as a very decent man. He was very strong-willed, that's true. He was trained at Annapolis. At Annapolis, they don't tell you, well, when you get to go chasing out there against Soviet submarines in your own nuclear submarine, that you'll have a vote as to what to do. The submarine's commander has the final say on what we do. It's not a debating society. And Carter brought that attitude to the White House. And so he had a very hard time with people like Tip O'Neill and Ted Kennedy, who believed that government in the United States was a discussion process with a compromise at the end. And this was hard for Carter to learn, but he learned. And it's well noted that when he left office, he was even greater as a humanitarian than he'd ever thought he'd be. And in fact, the world recognized it. Carter was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize with the Carter Center as the central item that's mentioned in this Peace Prize, because Carter went on helping people rebuild their lives, organizing teams that went out and worked on people's homes, people who were poor. There are a lot of poor people in Georgia and elsewhere. And the Carter Center was organized to do that, to give back, to help, to confront troubles and try and find solutions. And for that, he's deeply, deeply respected. He had made many goof-offs in his life. When he decided to run for president, he made a terrible mistake. He gave an interview to Playboy magazine. That's number one, you don't give interviews to Playboy. Number two, he said as a young man, he had seen a Playboy and he had lusted in his heart. Lusted in his heart is the direct quote. The next day, the polls showed he'd fallen 10% in the polls, excuse me, showing that we are a very strange people. That if somebody, a young man, had seen a centerfold and had lusted in his heart, was a major political error, was stupid on the part of the people who decided that was a bad thing for Carter to have said and to have done. Born-again Christians do not do things like that. Well, guess what? They do. So get over it. So Carter lived a long and prosperous life. He had gone back to Plains. He'd set his farm up. It worked. He made money. He got to be governor. He got a group of people around him who liked him. Hamilton Jordan was the key in that group. Hamilton became his chief of staff in the White House. They went on to do great things together. At the end, it didn't work out. He was an outsider, but a glorious and decent man. So it is that he is one of the few Americans who has won a Nobel Peace Prize. It's worth thinking about that somewhere in Scandinavia, they'd heard of him. They thought he needed to be rewarded, even if he didn't bring peace to the Middle East. He did finally end the great tragedy, which was our relations with our American neighbors. And in that sense, I praise him very highly, particularly given what came before and what came after. He didn't walk on water, but he was determined that the waters that went through the Panama Canal would be Panamanian. And they would run it, make a success out of it, and in that sense, be part of a better relationship with El Norte. El Norte is the key word that they use when they either damn us or they wonder what the heck we're doing with them as part of their policy projects. And we've had a history of failed. We even had a Kennedy attempt for an alliance for progress in the Americas. We've even tried to build a trans-American highway that cuts through the Central American states and feeds down into South America. All these things were sometimes for the good, sometimes only to encroach ourselves deeper. Already starting in Nicaragua was trouble ahead. There was a man who took Nicaragua, left. Why am I not surprised? And he had a real problem. Nicaragua produces a wonderful brand of coffee. And he had to get all the people out there to harvest that because he'd driven out the Americans. And as a little surprise that should not surprise you, we had a mayor in the little town of Berkeley, California, that decided to take the entire city council down to Nicaragua to help harvest the coffee crop. We'll tell you something about Berkeley politics, which is weird beyond weird. But it also will tell you something about the America and the America that's going to come, and that's almost to get Ronald Reagan sent out of office, because we're going to have the Iran-Contra issue. But I noticed that it's now 2 o'clock, which is the magic time around here when we all turn into pumpkins. So I'm going to leave you, and one of these days I'm going to come back and give you Ronald Reagan, the 40th President of the United States of America. Thank you for listening, and good day.
Thank you very much.
Who was that?
That was Byerly.
Oh. I didn't know they could get on. You're turning it off, I take it.